testing. Say something.
Something, check, mic check.
This has question. Possible. Is everything ready for tomorrow? Everything's good?
I sure as heck hope so.
Confident?
Am I? No.
You nervous?
Yes.
Hello, Justine.
Mic check, Mr.
All right.
Let me try.
So these, because we're able to cut these pretty well, now we got that flow down, we don't need to go as long as we went, as we usually go. So I'll make the questions a little bit more direct. What do you want to draw out of the assimilation one?
I thought you had something.
But I don't know if that's okay.
That's fine, just draw what you want.
So we'll start. I'm rolling.
اشرح لي صدري.
And we'll just do it just like this, like I'll be exploring it while you're exploring it, right?
Okay.
The issue right now is that assimilation seems to be the topic of the day for the Muslim community. Even like at ISNA, you have all these conversations, and when I went to the Google training, whatever, it was on assimilation. But that doesn't necessarily apply to all of us. And the conversation on my page the other day was just about, I posted that respected conversation on assimilation, understand why it has to happen, fully down, supportive, whatever, but just want to recognize that it doesn't necessarily 100% apply to all of us. And my contention was it may be integrating certain aspects of our culture does apply, but in terms of assimilating, because my contention was you can't assimilate to a culture that you're already in. So I don't really know what I want to flesh out about it, but I think there needs to be distinction for people on what it means to, what assimilation means. Because you know, first, second generation loses the language, third generation is it? Third,
First language, second culture, third religion.
Third religion, and it seems to be going that way. What is assimilation?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, the esteemed scholar, he says that Muslims in the West are between one of three options. One being total assimilation, the other being total isolation, and the third being a calculated integration. So total assimilation being where Muslims essentially lose all of what makes up their identity as individuals in a community for the sake of assimilating into the broader community. And he would argue, as I understand, as I would argue, that that's a blameworthy extreme. Total isolation being where the Muslim community basically insulates itself from the broader community, develops isolated micro-communities in which there's not a bidirectional process with the broader community of borrowing good and also objecting to that which is negative. The third, which he argues is the intelligent approach, and the one that I would tend to agree with, although this needs some unpackaging, is a calculated integration. And that's a loaded word, because integration itself, in some people's mind, may mean the same as assimilation. That if we're going to integrate, then that means we're going to assimilate. But I think the more important part of that idea is the calculated part. In other words, it can't be a kind of haphazard, no man's land, let it just be organic and let it be natural. And there's a number of reasons why that's problematic. One of them is there's a lot of assumptions about what normalcy is in America. And there's a lot of assumptions about what being normal means. And oftentimes when Muslims talk about what normal is, they're actually talking about whiteness. And whiteness as...
Go ahead.
I can't focus.
This thing is bothering me.
You want to start over?
No. Just we'll run back that last point.
Because of the pants, maybe?
Look around. Okay, okay. Okay, this is dope, because I never heard this before. Roll.
Yeah, so like, in order to have a calculated integration, you have to understand yourself and you have to understand the other. But as Muslims, that becomes very difficult, partly because, oh, he's my friend, he's my brother, we're all one. He's trying to kill me. He's obviously otherized me, so shouldn't I then otherize him? In the heat of the battle, the Prophet uses very specific language, Allahumma ihdi qawmi. Oh Allah, guide my people. فَإِنَّهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. For indeed they do not know what they're doing. And in the narration in Sahih Muslim, Allahumma ighfir li qawmi فَإِنَّهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. Oh Allah, forgive my people, for they don't know what they're doing. Now Muslims often cite these very narrations to talk about how, to suggest that Islam is pacifist, or to suggest that even in the battle the Prophet ﷺ didn't want bad for people, which has a place, and there's definitely a conversation around that. But what I'm trying to look at here is that the Prophet didn't see them as other than him, even as they were trying to kill him. If you're going to otherize somebody, wouldn't it be when they're trying to kill you? So then how do Muslims unpackage the idea of integration or assimilation or isolation unless we have necessarily otherized the dominant culture, or that the dominant culture has otherized us? So we've already began the conversation framed in otherization, that these people and us and them, you're either with us or with them type of framework, which is problematic. Am I saying that, we're all the same? Am I saying that, we all live in a big, happy palace where everyone gets along and there's no problem? Am I saying that, there are not real issues in society? Absolutely not. My people descend from slaves and from Native Americans who had the genocide committed against them, and from the Europeans that committed both of those things. So, I know about complexity when it comes to trying to understand your identity and understand the historical experience of your people. I get it. But the idea that we have begun saying that we want to assimilate is problematic, because there's all kind of things left out about the realities of the dominant culture and what we even mean when we say the dominant culture, and what house is it that we're trying to make our way into, what's going on in that house, and what does that have to do with the sustainability, the longevity of our existence as a religious community. See, it's really like what we've got to do is develop more complex thinking, and we've got to get back to sophistication and maturity as a community when it comes to the stuff of cultural production. Because if we're not producing our own culture, if we're not making culture and self-validating, self-authenticating, then we will necessarily be controlled by those who otherize us by saying you are this or you are that. In other words, if somebody else defines who you are, then they necessarily control you. So if we think of ourselves as a victimized, religious minority community that is powerless and that, has no place at the table, then that's how we're going to behave. And ultimately, that's what we will produce. We will produce the results of a defeatist people. And like they say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So if we're not going to be at the table discussing the realities of our cultural experience as a community in this society, our political stance vis-a-vis things that are happening politically, our economic presence in this country, et cetera, or in the world, then we're just letting other people define that for us. And so that's not calculated. Calculated means that we understand ourselves, we understand who we are, and there's a lot that the Muslims have to do in terms of just the social sciences and understanding sociologically who we are as a community. One of the problems with our community is that we're trying to have this conversation removed from historical context. We often think of ourselves, and we may not say this, but I believe that many of us think of ourselves as kind of like the minority. You know, we are the otherized, victimized people. We are one of many, many, many people. We are one of many, many communities that has been otherized, marginalized, and oppressed in the society or in the West in general. We're not the only people. So when we think in an isolated way, then we react in an isolated way. But if we think of ourselves as a community that is connected to communities that have struggled for their proper place in society ever since the birth of this nation, and in reality, even before the birth of this nation, then we're connected to a historical legacy. We're no longer disconnected. We're no longer thinking, there's no longer a knee-jerk reaction. Simply put, have we really read up on the civil rights movement and everything that happened in the civil rights movement and the different voices that were having that conversation and the different people that were struggling in that struggle? Do we really know about the realities of the Native American community and everything that has gone on for those beautiful 500 plus nations of beautiful sovereign people that were wiped off of the face of the planet in the name of manifest destiny? Do we understand that? And Muslims may not like this, but do we understand the struggle of the Jewish community in America? Do we understand the struggle of the Irish community in America? The Chinese community in America? And then we talk about immigrants, and Muslims want to agitate the idea of immigration, and there are some Muslims who even would suggest that we should do away altogether with referring to Muslims who hail from Muslim majority countries with the word immigrant. But in the mind of the broader society, when you talk about immigrants or immigration, who are the first people that come to mind? People from Mexico, undocumented workers from Mexico and South America. And all of a sudden, we're talking like a community that is separated from even that large of a community that is really dealing with the realities of immigration, such that it's agitating questions of policy all the way to the top of the power structure. So simply put, we have to stop thinking like some little unique minority. We have to stop thinking like, oh, poor us, poor us, poor us. I know I'm way off.
No, you're not. It's actually, I think this is one of your best ones. Because you're passionate about the subject. And this is stuff that they need to hear too.
Are you still rolling?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the reasons that it's the whole frame is really problematic is that so then converts are going to say, well, how can I assimilate into a culture that I'm already part of? And even that has a lot of problems because, well, you may be part of this culture. You may be a white African American, Latino, or Asian American convert to Islam. But as soon as you embraced Islam, you joined a community that has been otherized by the dominant society. So, and this is why, that's why white converts oftentimes have such a hard time, because it's basically cultural apostasy. If you convert to Islam, it's like, oh, you became one of them? It doesn't matter how light your skin is. Exactly. You've gone from being part of the white norm to now being part of this otherized group of people. So then converts have almost the opposite struggle, to where they're saying, everything about my psychocultural experience is American or Australian or British, etc., or Mexicano, etc., etc. Everything about how I feel about the world and how I see the world and what I eat and how I dress, how I feel around holidays, how I process birth and death, etc., is all made up from the cultural experience of a people who did not identify as Muslim. So now I have to kind of undo and reconcile and negotiate, where does my religion come in and how does it influence and how does it negotiate with my cultural identity? So a convert is saying assimilate. It's like, yo, I'm actually trying to do the opposite. I'm trying to unpackage how I feel about certain things that are contradictory to this new faith that I have joined, while being authentic to the faith and not committing cultural apostasy or not becoming, frankly, socially backward. So it's almost kind of like, well, how do I assimilate? However, as a convert to Islam in America or in the West in general, if I truly identify as a Muslim And if that's the primary thing that I identify as, so I may be Muslim dash, fill in the blank. Muslim male, Muslim American, Muslim whatever. But if the primary thing I identify as is a Muslim, then I'm naturally going to sympathize with Muslims globally. And I'm naturally going to feel a sense of responsibility toward Muslims globally, if I truly identify as a Muslim primarily. So now, if the default way that Muslims are looked at is as terrorists, that's a lot more than even other. That is an antagonistic enemy. So it's not just like, oh, these are, different people with a different way. It's like, no, these people are the bad guys. So now as a Muslim in America or in Australia or in the UK or in Canada, if I'm a convert and I'm a Canadian or an Australian or an American and I identify as that, but I'm also a Muslim, now I've got to what? Well, how do I reconcile the crazy stuff that's happening in the Muslim majority world with the often crazy things that are happening at home? And then where do I fit in all of that? Welcome to the struggle. Welcome to the struggle. Which is why I really believe, especially for young people, it's important that we provide a way for people to be producers of culture. That we're the subjects when it comes to the stuff of understanding and expressing and augmenting culture and agitating culture. We're not just passive objects. In other words, somebody wants to twerk. The Muslims should automatically be like, yo, that's super lame. Even before getting into, that's really disgraceful. Even before getting to, that's blatantly haram. A Muslim should not want to have anything to do with something that is produced by anybody that is A, impermissible, B, not classy, C, that is shameful. A Muslim should just be like, oh yeah, that's not what we do. So would we be like, oh, how do we come up with the Muslim version of the twerk? And we'll call it the mwerk. Because we want to be like them too. No, we don't want to be like them. And when we say them, we don't mean non-Muslims or Americans. We mean people that are doing things that are not respecting American culture. They're not respecting humanity. They're not respecting basic human dignity. Let alone, so in other words, it's not as simple as don't be like the Americans. Don't be like the Australians. Don't be like the Brits. No, within America, there are hundreds and hundreds of subcultures. And part of the problem is that we live in especially with the advent of social media, things have begun to become homogenized. So you got monoculture. So it's like everybody's doing it. And because everybody's doing it, I necessarily have to do it. And that's one of the beautiful things about the Prophet ﷺ. Like the Arabs wore turbans, and that's what they wore. The Prophet ﷺ also wore a turban, but he tied it differently than they tied it. So does he come and say, oh, they're doing it, so let me be like them? He's saying like, no, we do this, but I'm gonna do it differently. It wasn't adopting from the other. It was saying, I'm already part of this dominant culture, but I'm going to distinguish myself. So the Prophet ﷺ tied his turban counterclockwise. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. The Prophet ﷺ comes to Medina and finds that the Jews are fasting the 10th of Muharram, which is the first day of the Hijri calendar. And he asked, why are they fasting? And he's told they're fasting because it's the day that Moses was saved and Pharaoh was drowned, to paraphrase. And the Prophet says, we have more connection to Moses. We have more right to Moses. Muslims may read that and say, see, forget about the Jewish community. When the Prophet says we have more right to Moses, part of what he's saying is, I am the fulfillment of that prophecy that God revealed to Moses that there'll be a prophet from the children of Ishmael. Part of what the Prophet is saying is that by way of the fact that I've received revelation from Almighty God, and by way of the fact that I'm the last prophet, and by way of the fact that I am the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 18:18, I'm more connected to Moses even than this community is. So what does the Prophet do? He fasts. Like the Jewish community was fasting. But he says, if I lived another year, I would add to it the 9th day. In other words, He borrows from what another faith community is doing for all intents and purposes, but adds to it something that his community is going to do, which is why Muslims will fast the 9th and the 10th most often. In other words, it's not just take. It's like, even if I'm going to appropriate from another culture, I'm going to make sure that that's a bidirectional process. That I'm going to what? I'm going to also add part of what is authentically me, not from an egotistical place, but from an authentic place of cultural, religious, social, integrated, whole sense of self, and I'm going to make sure that that's part of that process. You see the difference? There's a big difference between being passive consumers of culture. We'll just be people who, whatever the dominant popular culture produces, we'll just take it. Which is why, if we're being honest, the whole hipster thing is really lame for Muslims to be involved in. And that's why I don't like being called hipster Muslim. I don't like being called hipster Islam.
Why do you think you're called that?
I think that people are not able to differentiate between that which is culturally authentic and that which is culturally inauthentic. In other words, if I, as a Muslim, was wearing a robe and a cloak and had a shawl and had a turban on, which I do fairly often, say right now in this film, I was wearing that, no one would look at me and say, oh, he's a hipster. Because he's wearing what? Things that reflect fashion genre that is consistent with what Muslims have historically worn and with what the Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, wore. But if I just wear jeans and a t-shirt, or if I wear, pants and a baseball cap, or if I wear, if I wear something too cool, it's like, oh, he's a hipster.
So how do we then, if you're talking about people that need to appropriate culture creators, what are our benchmarks for doing it?
Well, Dr. Jackson, hafidhahullah, Allah preserve him, he talks about in Islam and the Third Islam and the Black American.
If you call it from the outside, there you go.
Yeah. Dr. Jackson, Allah preserve him, talks about in Islam and the Black American, he talks about the idea that as American Muslims gain agency in the tradition of Islam and what he calls the Sunni super tradition, that is to say, the normative tradition of Sunni Islam, that as American Muslims, and particularly Black American Muslims, gain agency and have the ability to function and to work critically as people from that tradition, that it will act as an accelerator and as a brake. In other words, if we understand Islam correctly, it will accelerate the process of cultural production, but it'll also be the thing that makes us say, well, slow down a minute. Right? Going a little bit too far. So does Islam say to us, like, nah, man, y'all shouldn't be hip. Y'all shouldn't be cool. Y'all shouldn't be, contemporary. Y'all need to be old-fashioned and lame. In order to be authentically Muslim, you need to be foreign, old-fashioned, and lame. Hasha lillahi ta'ala. Far be it from God. That the truth would say that in order to be spiritually authentic, you have to be old-fashioned and awkward and weird. That's the most asinine thing I've ever heard in my life. And it's the opposite of what I've seen from the realest Muslims I've ever met. They're the opposite of all of that. They're contemporary, they're debonair, they're classy. You know what I'm saying? They're not weird, they're not. So in other words,
wasn't Imam Malik like that?
Kaif. Imam Malik, yeah. I mean, imagine that before he would even narrate a hadith, Imam Malik would go bathe and put on his finest clothes and put on his turban and perfume himself and burn aloes wood and sit on a chair before he'd even mention a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And again, that's what people wore, but Imam Malik was known to be, it was augmented. It was an accentuated, classy, beautiful embodiment of both the prophetic legacy and what was good culture, if you will.
So there's two fallacies then. One, you have to be lame, and one, you can't be cool or classy.
Right. Well, so the accelerator. So he says it's going to be an accelerator and a brake. And I'm talking about my understanding. I'm not speaking on behalf of Dr. Jackson. When you talk about being an accelerator, then like Islam should encourage us to be people who do things that are culturally relevant. It should encourage us to do things that are socially relevant. It should encourage us to do things that they stick with people. Like, oh, that I'm vibing with that. I like that. I'm not mad at that. But it also will tell us, like, we have this thing called the sacred law. And so if we're going to do that, let's not do things that go outside of the sacred law. So, like, can you do things that are, like, super, super cool and even really edgy and not break the rules at all? I believe you can. But there's this other whole thing that's happening, and that is what some call the end of first order expression. The end of first order expression means what? People are no longer doing things that are unique for the first time, culturally. It's just all regurgitating. It's all taking old things and just doing second order expression. Even if you look at films, what are we watching now? Remakes of old characters. Or just kind of mashups of like other themes that were in other movies under a different name. Is it called a mashup?
Same with music, yeah.
Mashup is when you just,
Put them together.
Right? Yeah. So like the idea that like, can I do something that is creative? And it's interesting that in Arabic, the word for innovation and the word for creativity come from the same root. Bid'ah, which means innovation, which is a real strong buzzword for many Muslims, because to do something that is innovative in the tradition, i.e. it goes against the essential textual basis of Islam, and to introduce something that is not consistent with the tradition, to say that, for example, Muslims should fast a different month than Ramadan, or to say that Muslims should pray 3 units of prayer for Dhuhr, that's explicitly prohibited. But there are different forms of innovation. There's praiseworthy innovation. There's reprehensible innovation. But the word for innovation and the word for creativity, ibda', come from the same root. And what do we take from that? Well, if I'm going to create, I've got to be innovative, but not innovative to the end of damaging the tradition. So I'm going to accelerate and be like, wow, like I got to do something creative. And so it's funny when you see people, you know, Emerson said there comes a point in every man's education where he arrives to the conclusion that envy is ignorance and that imitation is suicide. So now what do? I just look at someone else who does something cool. I'm gonna do that too, and I just imitate them. But what have I done? I've killed myself, because I have creative gifts as well. I have the ability to do something unique as well. But I'm just gonna take what this organization or this filmmaker or this artist or this fashionista or this connoisseur or this aficionado did, and I'm just gonna do like a really lame imitation of it. Right? Nah, do something unique. But in order to do that, you have to be in touch with your deepest truths as a person. You have to be in touch with who you really are. What do you really like? What do you really dislike? And then if it's like, what if I like something that other people don't like? And I'm not talking about like wine and baby back ribs. I'm not talking about things that are like pork ribs, things that are explicitly prohibited. No, within the realm of, which is the majority of things, that which is permissible. Aslul ashya al-ibaha. The origin of things is permissibility. The origin of things is purity. Why have we as a community adopted that haram is the default? Everything's haram. Everything's impure. People have constructed a world, some people, of najasa and haram. They walk around a world of everything's impure and everything's haram. I can't touch anything. I can't do anything because it's impermissible.
I'm invigorated. Like I keep forgetting to turn on my other camera.
So within the realm of that which is permissible, be creative. But be in touch with yourself. See what's real for you. Don't just look at what other people are doing. Well, how do I do that? Well, you got to get to know yourself. And you got to be able to have a space when you can look at both the pain and the beauty of being who you are. And then express yourself from that place. And if you look at really good artists, that's exactly what they're doing. They're not imitating other people's pain and beauty. They're in touch with their own pain and beauty. And they're expressing themselves from that place. The best of the best, whether Muslim or non-Muslim. They're not talking about other, they may speak, and because it's real and because it's authentic, it becomes universal. Because you're talking about what's real for you, and someone else is like, yo, that's real for me too. But if you just try to be, a kind of a hodgepodge, mashup version of somebody else, it's not going to speak to anybody. And it's sad that we're in an age when mashup and when imitation and when low, lame culture gets pulled off. People get away with it. People spend money on it. We're in the age of the Gangnam Style, where 1 billion plus people could watch a completely absurd video. 1 billion people watch a video and say, why would you waste that much time on it? And I'm not saying like, don't watch movies, don't watch TV. I'm not saying, just be really selective and see what's really authentic and what's good and what's part of not only being a good Muslim, but being a good human.
For us as Muslims, creating culture.
I'm way off from the whole assimilation thing.
No, it totally ties in. For us as Muslims, because assimilation is about the ability to create your own culture. That's what you're providing. You're providing the solution now, rather than just assimilate. Create your own culture. Create your. But what I hear you saying is that part of like a prerequisite to creating your own culture is, one, you have to know yourself, and two, you have to be creative, right? How do you break out of the how do you do it? How do you break out of the need to follow and be like, because what happens to marginalized communities, they want to be accepted, and that wanting to be accepted without using like religious ideals as your dhabit is dangerous, because you just do anything to be accepted.
Well, the first thing is you have to, if as a Muslim, you have to make sure that you understand Islam correctly and that you're studying it from authentic sources with qualified scholars, so that you're not learning a form of Islam or teaching a form of Islam that is predatory or cancerous, or that goes against the normative tradition. And there are people teaching Islam in ways that are not only predatory but are cancerous. You have to make sure that you gotta really be careful. What do I mean by that? If people are told things like, brother, you can't be American and be Muslim, I'm sorry, that has no basis in the tradition. You cannot bring a text that shows me people cannot be of a national or ethnic subset and be Muslim at the same time. You cannot prove to me that being American is somehow antithetical to being Muslim. And I'm not saying that means that you agree with everything that America does. I'm not saying...
Just like your example of the Prophet in Mecca.
Yeah, the Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, was a Meccan. And then he moves to Medina and he represents, and he's now in Medinan society as a Meccan, but he's known, I swear by this land, and you are a lawful citizen of this land. That's the Quran. You're a lawful citizen of this place. God in the Quran talks about the Prophet's citizenship in Mecca. That's how real it is. The very society that's fighting against the truth, that's exiling him.
Yeah, so you're not talking about post-return Mecca.
No, the Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, as he leaves Mecca, what does he say? He speaks to her in the second person and says, you are indeed the most beloved city to me. And if it were not that your people cast me out, I would never have left you. That's how much he loved that's how much he loved Mecca. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam.
But what was going on in Mecca at that time when he loved it?
They're trying to kill him and kill his companions and stop Islam. They're trying to stop Islam, and he's still saying about Mecca, what? I love you. And then the hadith we mentioned, these are my people, as they're trying to kill me, my people. The Quran, and we sent to them their brother Hud, and we sent to them their brother Lot, and we sent to them their brother so-and-so from amongst the prophets. Why is Allah mentioning this? Yes, you're going to bring a message to people who have fallen into error, but they're still your brothers. They're still your people. Help your brother, whether an oppressor or oppressed. We know, O Messenger of Allah, how to help our brother if they're oppressed. But how do we help our brother if he's an oppressor? By stopping him. Muslims will cite this hadith time and time again and not look for a moment at the fact that the Prophet said, help your brother, the oppressor. The oppressor's my brother? Unfortunately, yeah. The oppressor's my brother, and when I'm stopping his oppression, I'm doing it not by otherizing him and hating him, but by loving him as my brother, at least in humanity, but I'm still going to stop him. That's what we've lost. We've lost nuance in how we understand Islam. We've lost the nuance. And it's the same thing that we've lost in culture. We've lost nuance in culture. Attention to detail. Check out the subtleties. Be in touch with the nuances. So number one, you got to make sure that you're learning Islam from an authentic source in a way that is not predatory, in a way that is not, in a way that does not breed dysfunction, so that you're able to identify properly as whoever you are. And then the second thing is that you've got to make sure that in whatever society you're in, and in our case, as American Muslims, we have to be able to say, I'm Muslim, and that's who I am. And that's a matter of commitment. And that happens to be the primary element of my identity. That happens to be the primary way I identify. But simultaneously, I'm also American. And that's real. It's not, I'm not attempting to claim that. That's my birthright. That's who I am. That's who my father was and his father was. And in the case of many of us, up until the point we were brought here as slaves, or our parents may have immigrated from another place, etc. I've got to be able to say I'm an American. That happens to be my national identity. And in doing both of those things, I maintain a critical mind. What do I mean by that? I'm able to agree with the Muslims when they do good and disagree with the Muslims when they do bad. But if I do so, I'm doing so as a Muslim. And as an American, I'm able to agree with America when she does good and disagree with America when she does wrong, but I do so as an American. And those are both authentically Muslim and authentically American. And what that introduces is an alternative modality. It introduces a different way of being in the society. I'm not a fifth column, but I'm also not going to sign up for anything that the power structure does and just say that I agree with it. No, that's un-American. That's un-American. So now we've introduced a different way of being. And think just for a moment. A person converts to Islam in this country, prays 5 times a day, fasts Ramadan, pays zakat, makes hajj, etc. But they eat hot dogs, they barbecue hot dogs, but they just happen to be halal. They drink during holidays, but it's just apple cider, it's not champagne. For real.
Jeremy, can you get that? Yeah.
Say it, inshallah, than I was saying it last time. Well, like, yeah, if you say we want to assimilate, that means that we want to leave who we are and become who the other is. If you say that we want to isolate, you're saying we want to make sure that we stay who we are and borrow no good from the other. If you say that you want to integrate in a calculated way, you say that you want to reconcile your presence and take the good from the other, leave the bad, and also offer good to the other. And I think that's the really important part, is that you want to be a source of good for the society. You want to introduce an alternative way of being for those things that are negative. When I think about, what I mean by that, when I think about those of us that converted to Islam, who, God willing, remain authentically American, and that's a process. There's the kind of the disruption that many converts go through. But those of us who convert to Islam and remain authentically American, we also, there's certain things that we're not going to budge on. Like, I'm not going to eat pork, no matter what. I'm not going to drink alcohol. I'm not going to engage in usurious transactions. I'm not going to do X, Y, or Z that is explicitly prohibited, to the best of my ability. That's introducing a different way of being. And it's not to say that it's for everybody. It's not to say that everybody's going to convert to Islam. But to say, with this faith orientation, with this commitment to my way, I'm going to be as American as sweet potato pie. But I'm also going to, I'm going to not eat the ham. And I'm not going to drink the wine. And I'm not going to engage in unethical financial transactions. What does that introduce to the society? A way to be who you are, but not be engaged in unethical things. So it introduces a different way of being. It doesn't mean that you're un-American. And there are a lot of different ways to be American. And there's also, and this is going to be hard for some people to swallow, there's a lot of different ways to be Muslim. People don't want to admit that. Muslims have never been all the same. Muslims never will be all the same. There have been Muslims on either end of the spectrum of liberal and conservative, or any other number of frames that you want to create. Something I've been thinking about a lot the last few days is that predatory conservatism is is really ugly. But so is predatory liberalism. What do I mean by that? People who are so conservative that they have to force their conservative stance on other people. That this is my commitment, and I'm super scrupulous and super rigid, and you should be too. And if you're not, then you're a bad person. But then on the opposite extreme, you've got people who are what? Super liberal. And since I'm super liberal, you have to be too. And if you're not, you're old-fashioned, and you're backward, and you're lame. Those are both really abhorrent things. But I've been thinking a lot about how the fact that at least people who are conservative, when they maybe object to certain things, they can make the excuse that it comes from a place of commitment to tradition. What's your excuse when you're predatorily liberal? That you have a disdain for tradition? That you have a disdain for commitment to morality? And I'm not saying that you're liberal. Being liberal or being conservative are options. But I'm saying being predatorily conservative or predatorily liberal. At least if you're conservative, you're saying, that's just a little too loose for me. And if you're liberal, you're saying, that's a little bit too rigid for me. But if you're predatorily liberal, you say, what? Don't criticize me. It's my way. This is how I do. And you're old-fashioned because you have a commitment. That's super lame. What? That you only eat animals that are slaughtered a particular way. That's super lame that you don't drink and that you don't smoke and that you don't fornicate. That's so like 1800s. Like, but so how do you negotiate your presence in the world? How do you exist as a Muslim and say, yo, I'm not trying to be either one of these extremes. I want to try to find khayrul umur awsatuha. The best of matters is the most moderate. But again, if I'm allowing people on the extreme right or people on the extreme left to define who I am, then I never get an opportunity to negotiate that process for myself. May Allah make it easy for us.
How do we then, taking all of that into consideration, and your Ballet Girl 1800s voice, how do we I think this is important. How do we as a community allow for all these different facets that you're talking about, or different modalities or different ways to be Muslim? How do we allow people to have that type of self-expression? And really what I'm getting is that why is something like this video that just came out a problem? Like, how do we allow, what does it mean to allow people to have these expressions? And
well, I mean,
when do we engage and when do we not?
Think about the way that like Muslims are trying to process their identity and how much social media has to do with it. Like, in other words, if a person wanted to do something that was like, they wanted to take a stance that was like super conservative and they wanted to write that stance. Or they wanted to take a stance that was like super liberal and they wanted to express that. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it would probably reach like a really, really small subset of the society. A person writes a book and it's like super rigid, an objection to X, Y, or Z. A few hundred people, maybe a couple thousand read it. If they're really prolific, whatever. Tens of thousands of people read it. Person wants to express himself in some really edgy way. They're really racy. And they do it. Historically, they would have had to have been really good to even get airplay. So a big part of this whole, I think part of the challenge is that we're trying to understand ourselves and express ourselves in an age of social media when everybody has a platform. So a person doesn't even have to be good. It doesn't have to be well done. It just has to go viral. It just has to spread. And if we're honest, going viral and quality are not the same. They're not the same. How many really talented artists are out there producing and no one ever hears about it? Doesn't have the right hashtag. The right person didn't retweet it.
Controversial.
Oh, it's not controversial enough. It's too, plain Jane. It's too old-fashioned. It's not whatever. So I think that when we talk about I think one of the things that we need as a community, and I think this is a struggle, is a conversation around netiquette. Like, what's the adab? what's the comportment of like having an online presence? Like, what are the negotiables and the non-negotiables? The reality is, in social media, there's not really any beside like don't post nude pictures and don't threaten people. Beside that, hey, whatever goes. I mean, I'm obviously generalizing, right? But like, how do we as Muslims say like, yo, there's certain things that are just like bad manners? For example, if you're gonna advise somebody about a question of religion, be sensitive to the fact that they're a real human being with real feelings and emotions and a good name to maintain and a family. And don't disparage them. Don't do things that are, you know what I'm saying? A simple one. There's a difference between direct messaging somebody and tagging them publicly in a tweet, or inboxing somebody or posting it on their page. You know what I'm saying? Like, just the idea that like, yo, if you wanna give somebody a word of advice, do so in a way that is wise. You don't have to be a jerk about it. I'm not answering your question.
No.
I forgot your question.
Because then we'll get into the criticism one, which I think is also equally important as this one.
Right.
But we'll save it. How we. What I'm thinking about is the takeaway for people from this in terms of culture creation and in terms of assimilation. And we started off talking about the differences of experiences and that some people are assimilating, and then you mentioned bringing it from the inside out rather than just from outside in. That's the difference you just made between converts and immigrants. That converts are negotiating what they're leaving off, and people that are assimilated are negotiating what they're taking on. So maybe just bringing it home to those two things.
Well, we've got to remember that America is a young nation by historical standards. So America's young, and the Muslims in America are also newcomers. Have Muslims been here since before Columbus? Yes. Has there been an African presence in the so-called New World since maybe even before Christ? Yes. That doesn't mean functionally Muslims in the society are fairly new. Islam is fairly new to the society. As Dr. Omar has argued, Allah preserve him, we haven't reached first effective settlement. We haven't got to a place where we have properly established ourselves in the society. There have been reflections of that, but there hasn't been a proper first effective settlement. So we're new to this society, and the society itself is new. And we've got to remember that America is a process, and it's a process that is underway as we speak. America is not some predetermined, boxed, set in stone country. And Obama's election is proof of that. Policy aside, just the reality of there being an African American elected to the White House is proof that, like, oh, things are still being negotiated. The civil rights movement is proof of that, and so on and so forth. And again, that's a beautiful, beautiful thing, but it's also a very painful thing. So if Muslims in America understand that, then we understand that we've got to be part of that process. We have to rise to the occasion of making sure that we are not allowing, rise to the occasion of defining who you are and self-authenticating and making sure that we understand our place in society in a way that is both critical, but it is also rooted in brotherly love and rooted in fraternal love and rooted in love for humanity. And if you do that, and then just be real, just be authentic. I mean, imagine if we just applied to what's going on out there, what used to be kind of the hashtagable buzzword of our generation. Keep it real. Like, yo, just be real, dude. Just be authentic. Not so well tied into that.
No, that's fine. I think it's good. Let's do a closing statement. You usually end on a positive about what you're looking forward to.
Right.
Right. What it means for us as a community if we do this right.
One option is that we don't try, and that I don't see any possible good outcome in that one. In other words, if we don't rise to the occasion of reconciling our presence as individuals and as a community in the society, then I think that equals failure. The other option is that we do try. And if we do try, one of two things can happen. We will succeed outwardly, i.e. there will be a beautiful day for Muslims in America, which will be a beautiful day for America. Or we outwardly fail, but inwardly succeed. And what does that mean? You know, it's not gonna be perfect. It's not gonna be puppy dogs and sunshine. There's gonna be some difficulty. There may be loss of life. There may be significant marginalization. There may be a really, really hard struggle, but we will have succeeded because we tried, because we attempted. And if you think back, Harriet Tubman, taking people on the Underground Railroad, she wasn't doing so with any guarantee that they were gonna make it.
There's hope option.
Dr. King, what did he say? He didn't say, I have certainty. He said, I have a what? I have a dream. You know, Malcolm was killed. They killed him. Would you say Malcolm failed? They took his life. In my mind, he succeeded. Because what did he leave? A legacy. A legacy for people who said what? Oh, I can become a better person. I don't have to stay at the bottom of the barrel. And two, a legacy that said, if you struggle, you can actually impact the society. And so millions of people are affected by that. So if we try, hopefully we'll be able to at least provide, you know, when the guy's in the ring, he might get knocked out, but you say what? He fought a good fight. You know, the person comes to the game, it's like, it's not about whether you win or lose, but it's how you play the game. Dude played a good game. He gave it his best. And I don't want to fail.
What's our collective goal?
To win.
How? I mean, at what?
The game. We've got to win the game. Put me in, coach. I'm ready to play. You know what I'm saying? When Amir Suleiman says we must win, who's we? What are you winning? He's not talking about a football game. He's not talking about a foosball match. He's not talking about who's we. There's a struggle. We have to win. We can't lose. We can't lose. We've got to try. Was that not positive enough? Hold on a second. Watch. If we root the seed of integrated calculation and the earth of a sound identity of self, a beautiful fruit of good Muslim banquet garden bistro flowers will blossom forth, henceforth creating the most beautiful bouquet of human orchids ever seen in the flower shop of history. And then the birds and the bees of beautiful, exotic, ecstatic understanding of God's beauty will come and take the pollen of our cultural expression and spread it throughout the forests of the human tree family. And we will therefore become somewhere between Fern Gully and Green Gulch.